Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance. On this podcast, I'm talking to my colleague, Ian Simons, who's Content and Capabilities Director here at the CII Group. We're talking about the CII and PFS's review of corporate chartered status. Thanks for joining me today, Ian.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Well, we're talking about corporate chartered status because you're currently undertaking a review of the corporate chartered rules. Now, what prompted that review?
So, in a sense, we're always reviewing. We take feedback. We look at what objectives we're trying to achieve. But it's been about, it was 2019 that we last had a chartered consultation where we sort of shared with members and wider stakeholders our thoughts on where it could go next. And we made some changes back then, but obviously that's quite a while back now, and a number of other things have changed since then. So in particular, we were looking at sort of our relevance, or the relevance of corporate chartered status to the public, and how well our criteria and rules aligned to the things that consumers, and by which I mean all types of consumers of insurance, not just people on the street, but businesses, anyone who's benefiting from insurance and personal finance, the relevance of the sorts of things that you're required to be able to demonstrate as a firm to get corporate chartered, and how well customers or clients of those products and services feel that delivers good outcomes. Does it feel like a professional service? Does it feel like something that gives you that trust and that you feel you're accessing that professional experience? So it was really a review rather than a fundamental change. And so we're looking at the same sets of principles and saying, is there more we could do to align to that direction?
Why might things have changed over that period of time? Can you give us some examples of the sorts of matters that might have evolved that have led you to reconsider the relevance?
Yeah, so like with all business change and strategy, you've typically got sort of a PESTLE type approach. So political change and economic change and technological change. There are things like consumer duty that have fundamentally challenged the regulatory environment. And we've always believed that corporate chartered needs to show firms that are going above and beyond the regulatory minimum. So where the requirements and the principles that have changed there need to be reflected in corporate chartered. So if one thing moves up or changes, then corporate chartered needs to be aligned with that and also move up. And that has very much looked at outcomes, customer outcomes, rather than rules and regulations. So that was also a prompt for us to look at, are we looking at measuring the right things in the right ways for corporate charters? So we have currently in our rules and criteria, it has in a way inputs like the number of our staff who are members of the CII, but less of a focus on outputs like how do we know whether we're increasing customer satisfaction or we are able to demonstrate an improved level of understanding of our products and services from our customers. So that's one of the areas. There's sort of regulatory change, but also the changing expectations of consumers, whether that's through how customers interact with other types of businesses and services. Everything obviously is increasingly digital, and that has an impact on what people's expectations are on the service they get, on the level of engagement and personalization they get. These are all things that affect what people have in mind when they say, I want a professional service. And so we want to reflect all of that in all changes. So there's lots of things that change, but we're trying to bring them all together under that principles of corporate chartered.
Well, you say lots of things change, and you've begun to touch on some of the potential changes as part of this review and consultation exercise there, Ian. But I suspect some things don't change. They're perennial in nature as well. Is that the case?
So the fundamental, what we call chartered ethos, hasn't changed at all. So the chartered ethos is about firms that sign up to nurturing knowledge, client centricity, and serving society. So we believe those are still the three key things that in lots of different ways, clients, customers, consumers expect from a professional firm. And that goes beyond personal finance or insurance, when you think about what you expect from a lawyer or an accountant or any other classic professions, you expect a combination of those things. Now, exactly what they look like year on year might change slightly, but the principle and framework there, we believe, is absolutely solid.
Yeah, and we've got something like, is it 700 firms who are corporate chartered status holders with us at this point in time? I mean, that indicates that there's a lot of positive feeling towards being a firm that holds this particular status, and they've bought into that ethos. And I guess we would also say, they're already setting themselves apart in so many positive ways.
That's really critical. The value that current corporate chartered firms get from that, we absolutely want to enhance, and that's why we've entered into this as a consultation rather than a set of changes. We want to work with those firms to understand what already works for them, what can be added to that to enhance it. We don't want to make things easier for anyone, but we want to make things accessible for anyone. So anyone who's willing to put the effort in to have the commitment to those standards should be able to get there if they're willing to put the investment, the time, and the resource into getting those sorts of standards. But we wouldn't bar anyone from it simply because of the structure of their business or any other factors that have been a challenge for some firms.
Yeah, well, that's really, really positive to hear. And we'll get on to some of the proposed changes in a moment. But I think it's really important to take a step back and ask you, Ian, how we've got to the point where we're at today with having some proposals that we're talking to our existing corporate chartered firms about. How have we gone through the process of coming up with these proposals thus far?
So we started with a couple of workshops with a small number of existing chartered firms. So we had 2 different workshops with a dozen or so representatives from corporate chartered firms, one focused on the general insurance sector and one focused on the personal finance sector. And although there were a lot of similarities, it's important to look at both of those sectors with quite a granular view because of the different business models, the different regulatory environment, etc., to make sure that those principles that I talked about can be applied relevantly in those areas. And they confirmed for us that there were a number of things that needed to change in order to be more relevant for their core stakeholders, but also that the kinds of areas we were looking to develop were feasible or could work for those firms. Doesn't mean everything would be easy or simple or perfect, but that it gave us the confidence that there was further detail we could go into in the next phase of getting stakeholder feedback.
And these workshops took place in 2024?
Yes. Towards the end of 2024, I think September, October, we had those workshops where we walked through some principles and some suggested areas that could be amended. Nothing was sort of taken off the table, but equally a number of things have sort of been reshaped fairly significantly based on that feedback, which we then evolved into a set of digital town halls that we delivered earlier this year in 2025.
These were in April, weren't they? And you had 8 of these digital town halls, which I was very pleased to have been invited to and got the opportunity to listen in on. And Ian, you presented at each of those, and we had something like just over 200 participants, didn't we?
Yeah, which is, when you think about the total number of firms at 700, not a bad proportion to make sure that everyone's had an opportunity to hear it at the highest possible level and an opportunity, obviously, critically to ask questions, to feedback, and to decide where to go next with it. So, yeah, we're really pleased with the level of engagement, not just participating, but a really rich response. As intended, some of that was quite challenging feedback as well. Some of it was supportive, some of it was querying how we make sure we maintain the rigor and the robustness and the credibility of the standards, because any change to something that works risks losing some of that. So that was really useful to understand what the highest area of risks were from our existing members' point of view, to make sure that we don't get any complacency over anything like that.
Well, let's get into the heart of this then. So, those digital town halls, and subsequently we've done a pamphlet distribution as well, haven't we, to existing corporate charter status firms, and we're also at BIBA talking to firms there. You've outlined a set of proposed changes. What are some of the headline changes that are as part of this review, Ian?
So overall, I'd go back to the principles that we talked about earlier of becoming more outcome focused and consumer relevant rather than input. So there are a number of things that have changed a little in order to move to that principle, and something that potentially we're suggesting could change quite a lot. And one key example of that would be the level of membership of the CII that a firm must have amongst its staff in order to get corporate chartered. So currently, it's required for any chartered firm to have 90% of their customer-facing staff members of the CII. Now, we don't want to reduce the focus on level of membership of professional bodies, but what we do want to recognise is that not all staff will necessarily need to be members of the CII itself. There may be other professional bodies they need to be members of. Equally, there may be parts of a business that may be customer-facing, depending on your definition of that, where perhaps membership of a professional body is not necessary to be at 90%. You can imagine some customer service call centres that have quite high turnover that may need to have a lower level of membership because of the frequency of that turnover and speed of upskilling people in those areas. And so we want to look at what the benchmark should be, much more by role and by area within a business, so that there's still a high level of expectations, but it has to be relevant to the role, rather than simply saying all customer-facing staff, of all of those staff, 90% must be membership, because that number has always been fairly arbitrary.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it feels like there probably was good reason for setting those figures where they were at that point in time. But from what you've heard and what other firms have been talking to us about over these past few months, they've been saying, haven't they, that on occasions this is a barrier. This is a barrier to them actually growing and expanding, and they're left scratching their heads about how they can continue to maintain chartered status while also being able to meet the demand for their services.
Absolutely. I mean, there's certainly a cost related to that. So if any firm felt that they had to pay for people to be a member of the professional body solely so that the firm could call itself chartered, but didn't actually intend for that individual member to become a professional through qualifications or any other routes, then that was never the intention. And if it drives that, and if it drives up that cost, and it isn't actually achieving better professional outcomes, then that's counterintuitive. And we wanted to break that potentially quite damaging perception that it's in the CII's interests to force people to pay for that membership. That was never the intention, and it reduces the credibility of the professional standard if people say, oh, it's really just so that the CII can force a lot of membership. And we wanted to break that sort of commercial conflict that we referred to there. The other piece around growth that is really important to bring out is in the financial planning sector. There's also an additional requirement that 50% of financial planners need to be individually chartered. And that definitely has a risk of restricting growth, because if you imagine you have, for example, 5 people working as financial advisors in your firm and 3 of them are individually chartered, then great, you're through. But as soon as one of them retires or moves on or whatever else happens, you've suddenly got a problem. And do you have to replace that person with someone who's already chartered? Or should we be encouraging firms to invest in apprenticeships, getting new entrants into the sector and building them into a profession of the future? Well, the rule would say that's actually not in your interest, because you would lose chartered status until you've got to that point. So that was something we really felt we needed to address.
And also, Ian, there's something about the rules potentially differing between the insurance and financial planning sectors. What can you tell us about that?
That's a really good question. The first thing is the principles won't differ, but we already have nuances, differences. We mentioned earlier, for example, because on the financial planning side, there's regulatory mandated regulatory qualifications, etc. There are some fundamental differences in the sectors that have differences in the rules, and we're looking to make sure that each sector has a model that works for them. So not just saying each business is different, let's come up with different ways of measuring them, but let's say, what does corporate chartered look like in the personal finance sector? It should still have those three core principles of client centricity, nurturing knowledge, and serving society, and the same overall criteria, but it should be owned by and built by and working for that sector, and making sure that it still has the same overall standards, but we're not simply saying we've come up with one model that needs to serve all, and then we try and tweak things around the edges just to fit people in. We actually want to position it as something that says, here is a pillar, we're referring it to the pillar of corporate chartered for personal finance, which we'll build with personal finance, and then here's the pillar for general insurance that we want to build with general insurance.
And Ian, benchmarking is clearly one area of the proposed changes to the rules here, but there's also other changes in relation to client centricity and serving society as well. What are some of the proposals that are in those areas?
So there are some examples of things we currently ask for that we want to beef up or make sure that they actually mean something. A great example might be a firm is currently required under corporate charter to have an EDI policy. But simply having an EDI policy, an equity, diversity and inclusion policy, doesn't necessarily achieve anything. I mean, hopefully it requires the firm to have thought it through and to be doing something there. But what we want to encourage firms to be doing is focus on the outcomes. So does that policy help the firm to ensure that it has a diverse staff who understand the diverse needs of its customers? How do they know that? What do they do to achieve that? Is that linked to their internal training around diversity, for example? Is it linked to their recruitment or to their communications to customers? So it's things like that. Or we've also got some suggestions or proposals that we would require evidence of where a firm has ensured that their fees and costs are communicated in a transparent way with customers. That sort of thing would have been implied within the previous or the current requirements, but not explicit. So we want to try and make those things more to the fore and more relevant to customers, so that we can be more confident when we go out to promote corporate chartered status to the public, that there are some really meaningful things for them. Because right now, we know that consumers recognize chartered status and they think it's a good thing, but they don't really know what it stands for or what it means. And it would be great if we were able to say, here are some things that we can show chartered firms actually do differently, which we would struggle with the current criteria. So it's about getting more evidence of what professionalism means within corporate chartered firms, because our chartered firms are the ones that can tell us what professionalism looks like, and we want to help get that data and evidence together to promote that to consumers.
Well, that's been absolutely fundamental to the exercise that you've been undertaking to this point in time, isn't it? Getting firms to tell us what they think. We could sit here, I'm sure, between the two of us, come up with a new potential set of rules, but frankly, I doubt we would be able to concoct something that was better than hearing from the firms themselves, those who are currently corporate chartered status holders and those who aspire to be holders of that particular status. So going out and talking to them has been central to the exercise. When you were in those digital town halls, when we were in those town halls, we clearly heard a lot of feedback in relation to some of the things that you set out there. Can you talk us through what some of the main themes were and how we've already responded in some of those cases as well?
Yeah, so I think there were some overlaying themes around risk of lowering standards, or if not lowering, the perception of lowering standards. So if I mentioned earlier, if we removed the blanket rule of 90% of customer-facing staff being members of the CII, then what's to stop firms racing down to 0%, for example? Or if we're saying you don't need to have exactly 50% of financial planners chartered individually, then what is the right level? And what's been really interesting is that chartered firms don't want this to be easier, but also they don't want to be impossible for themselves to get a consistent investment in that professional outcome. So it's getting that balance right between something that is challenging and appropriately so to ensure that firms are always increasing, but that isn't either impossible because it suddenly requires unrealistic investment in resource or anything like that, or the paperwork to be able to demonstrate it. So there was a lot of great feedback on those sorts of areas where we were able to sort of sound out where that balance should be struck. And we had a few follow-up conversations, and I'm planning many more, and I'd certainly encourage firms to sign up to join follow-up meetings to discuss what these could look like. But there have been examples of when we say we would bring in benchmarks instead of a percentage rules, what does that mean in practice? And we've got some ideas about that, but we actually need to shape those with firms and come up with a benchmark to test, rather than for, as you said there, for us to sit in a dark room and just come up with a number. That isn't going to work. We've got to understand what percentage would be appropriate for a business like this, of this size, doing these kinds of tasks. And we'll only know that by hearing from those firms.
And we'll put some contact details on this podcast so that people can get in touch. I also want to ask about fees and the cost of the exercises that firms might be subjected to in future in order to demonstrate they are at the right level to be holding this status. Can you talk us through the thinking around those, please, Ian?
Yeah, so the current fee structure, it's quite a confusing one, so I'll try not to go into too much detail on it, but essentially there's two parts to it. You've got the annual fee, which is tiered according to the size of the firm. So for a small firm of under 10 people, it could be £500 a year, up to £2,000 for the largest firm. Then aside from that, there is the implicit cost of maintaining the membership, which for some firms, as I said earlier, if firms have paid for staff to be members of the CII, even though they wouldn't otherwise have done that other than to achieve corporate chartered, then for those sorts of firms, that seems like effectively a cost of getting chartered. So by removing that part of it or changing the approach to membership, we want to get a really closer focus on a cost to serve the corporate chartered proposition, which is mostly going to be around the assessment. We want to make sure that there is a sustainable financial basis for us to be able to provide additional resource to walking through the application process with applicants and giving them feedback. We want to turn it away from being something that is basically fill in these forms and we'll tell you whether or not you've got corporate chartered, to share with us what your skills and development plans are, how you ensure client centricity, etc. And we will play back to you with rich data to benchmark you against your peers. And that will require investment in resource and systems outside. There's no getting away from that. So we have to find a way of making sure that the fee structure will support that. But we're totally open at the moment. We haven't come up with the answers. We are looking at the different models, but there's likely still to be a degree of tiering to make sure that it's a fair amount that reflects both the value to the firm and the cost to the CII. And we want to make sure that that's both reasonable for existing firms. We're considering staggering that so that firms can apply under the existing rules for a period, both to make it easier for them to transition, but also to make sure that they can budget. But for new firms who want to apply after we've announced the new rules, once they've been finalised, they would jump straight to whatever that new fee structure would be. So we want to try and find something that's fair, sustainable, and transparent. We're certainly not looking to make a surplus or a profit out of this. Any money that does end up not being immediately spent on those costs would be ploughed straight back into the corporate chartered proposition in areas like promoting to consumers, which is an area that we feel we've not been able to do enough of in recent years, and we're committed to doing more of. But we believe that will drive a lot more value to corporate chartered. We want to start with that value, is we want to show what the value will be and then make sure that the cost of achieving that is a fair representation of that to firms.
Well, I think that's absolutely fundamental, isn't it, Ian? I mean, if firms and individuals who are listening to this podcast want to know that they're getting value from holding corporate charter status with the CII, and paraphrasing a little what you've said previously in this podcast, is at this point in time, the CII feels as if it can generate more value for firms by adopting a new set of rules that build on the great set that have existed for quite a long time and have given opportunities to firms to flourish under the corporate chartered status badge, but revising them in some areas to add extra value to those that hold the status.
Yeah, that's absolutely it in a nutshell. We don't want to break what works for those who already have earned that through hard work and investment. That's what's really critical. We recognise and are hugely proud of the firms who have achieved it under the current rules. And we're not saying the current rules are wrong, but that there are areas they could be enhanced, and particularly driving that enhancement in a sense as a draw rather than a push. We want to draw more customers and potential clients to firms with corporate chartered by demonstrating that those holders are doing above and beyond what they currently are expected to do. So that value we need to be able to show directly to firms. So it might be things like, here's how the consumer promotion will drive recognition for your firm, and also indirect benefits where hopefully the language that firms are able to use about what the corporate chartered status means should be more understandable to clients, because we know that in some cases that can be a bit confusing. What is corporate chartered? We need to make that easier for firms to be able to translate.
Absolutely. Now, you touched on the desire from the CII and PFS perspective to drive public recognition of firms that hold the status in the future as part of adding that additional value. How do you see that working?
So I think it's going to evolve. Obviously, right now, we can, and when we have been able to, we have promoted literally with advertising to consumers to say, you should be looking for chartered, and this is what it means. So part of that we were looking to do more of, but also we want to use some of the insights and data that we're hoping to gather from chartered firms during the application and renewal process to be able to showcase specific firms that excel and go above and beyond. So we envisage that being awards, etc. If we could have chartered awards for firms that excel in areas such as vulnerability or other issues that we know are both critical to the profession but also relevant to consumers, those are the things that firms can obviously promote to their audiences, get their staff behind, and get a real positive motivation around not just ticking the boxes to achieve that chartered badge, but really driving it ahead and setting those standards. So it's a bit of both. Bit of it is simply directly promoting it, and I think that's a minimum requirement that we should be able to commit to as the CI, but also giving firms opportunities to excel and take that out to their own consumers.
So fees were another area that were touched on as part of the digital town halls, weren't they, Ian? And some firms were expressing concern that the costs of submitting themselves to review for the corporate charter status was going to rise as a result of the proposed changes. So how might the costs evolve? And also related to that, what might the implications be for the CII in terms of the revenue that is generated from awarding corporate chartered status?
Yeah, so first off, I'd say the revenue is a necessary part of the process, but not a driving one. It's simply that, this is not a commercial driver for the CI, but obviously it has to be financially sustainable. So we're not sitting there going, can we get more money through this? We're a professional body, obviously not for profit, and it needs to be sustainable. But yeah, the revenue, it would cause an unsustainable situation if it suddenly went down, or if the costs were not sustainable alongside the revenue. And the reality is right now, I would not expect anything other than a slight level of concern that what looks like it might increase, I can't clarify with a, yes, it's going to move up by X% or anything like that. And that's because we're starting with getting feedback on what needs to change, which will then define what's the cost of implementing that change, which will then define, okay, how do we need to be able to charge to cover that? And it was a deliberate choice to go through that process. But from an outside point of view, I can see where that would be confusing and alarming because I can't tell you by how much or when that could potentially go up. But inevitably, if we are going to do if we're going to add more value through this process, so rather than having an administrative task of checking, is there evidence to support you've got corporate charter standards, but more having a value-added consultative conversation. So we're talking about giving firms fairly rich report as a result of this, not just, yes, you got it, but here's where you scored well against your peers. Here are some things that you might want to look at that other peers have done successfully. And that should then drive a more constructive conversation with where can we help you?
Helping them to further set themselves apart in future as a result of learning from what they're doing well now and what others are doing.
Exactly. And where can we help you with some of those? So it might be areas where we uncover something that, it might be that other firms are doing more with their staff doing CPD events or something like that. How can we help your firm get more of that? So it's embedding that within everything else that we already do within the professional body, rather than simply saying this is a task or a process that sits on the side of the CII to give firms a badge. So there's a lot that we hope will be adding value in the process, which will require us to, as I say, add resource to making sure that's done properly, which we'll need to find a way of covering.
But it also introduces more flexibility, doesn't it, for firms to determine themselves how they're going to demonstrate that they've met that particular threshold. I mean, part of the exercise was to ask the question, if an individual firm came to us and said, we believe we are operating at the level of a corporate charter status firm, but we aren't able to demonstrate it against the current rules, how might we demonstrate it? So there's a uniqueness to this, isn't there? There's an element of saying, you tell us how you are demonstrating that you are setting yourselves apart at this point in time.
Yeah, that's really key. And it's another one that's challenging to make sure that doesn't look like we're changing rules to suit anyone, because it's again, where if we've got the principles right and we've got the outcome measures better, then it's up to firms to show us what their particular inputs are. And in a practical sense, that means that we're expecting to resource up to take evidence in pretty much whatever format firms think they can share with us. So if we're going to ask questions like, what is your governance oversight protocols or whatever, that will be a range of different documents, spreadsheets or whatever that they'll share with us. And it will be for us to pick through that and probably have conversations with them to say, right, have we understood this bit correctly? Yes, this looks like this fits what we're looking for. Tell us more in this area. So that would be quite an iterative, interactive conversation, but is very much about that flexibility to ensure not that we are bending the rules, but that we're applying them appropriately to what are inevitably going to be different businesses with different strengths and weaknesses.
And also there's the opportunity, isn't there, for firms to say, well, we're already producing this particular piece of evidence for this other audience, the Financial Conduct Authority, for example, with board reporting. Can we use this as part of our reporting for corporate charter status as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a classic example of one where we mustn't duplicate or repeat work for anyone that if it already exists. So we want to trial that out. We want to actually look at what that will be like in practice. But in principle, I see no reason why quite a lot of the information that we're looking for will already be in that Consumer Duty FCA report that all firms will need to produce anyway. That would be a great starting point for firms to say, here it is. It was produced X months ago, so it's all still up to date, or maybe here are some areas where we can give you some more detail. And then it's for us to work with that. And there'll be other examples, things that firms have put together, perhaps if they're applying for things like B Corp or investors in people, there'll be things that firms are already doing that show they excel. And we'll work with that, at least to begin with, and then apply it to our rules.
Okay. Now, the consultation is ongoing, isn't it, Ian? You're having conversations with firms currently. We've had the digital town halls. We've had the distribution of the pamphlet and the video. And we've got a webpage as well where anybody can find out more about where we are in this particular exercise and see all the answers to the questions that have been raised thus far, of which we've had dozens. And it's been terrific to be able to see the feedback and be able to weave it into the evolution of the proposals at this point in time. What are the next steps? You've talked about there being an assessment phase for the potential new rules at some point. When's that likely to happen? What number of firms are you looking for to take part in that particular exercise?
So it starts right now. So by the time you're listening to this, I will already be, and some of my colleagues will already be discussing in detail with firms what data they'd be able to share with us against the current criteria. So we want more firms, frankly. I don't know exactly what the upper limit could be that we need to have spoken to, tested or whatever to check that our theories or our presumptions will work in practice. But it's going to be something like 50 firms as a minimum. So what that looks like will be some initial conversations with firms individually, possibly in some small groups if there are groups that have similar needs and expectations, where we walk through line by line the types of evidence we think firms would be able to produce that would support the criteria in the new proposals. And then firms either share that data with us, or maybe in some cases they say, well, we haven't actually got that. It would be quite hard for us to get, but we have got this other thing that we think would demonstrate that. So that'll be a real learning process. And the more firms and more different types of firms that go through that with us, the better chance that whatever we emerge with at the end of that will work for the majority of firms. Every firm will be different. We're making sure that we're doing segments of different sizes, different types, different business models, different regions. All the different types of firms that could get corporate chartered will have to go through that process in order for us to be confident that we've got that balance right of flexibility to suit those different types, but an overall standard to match.
If firms are interested in taking part, they can email us at chartered.consultation@cii.co.uk, and we'll put that email address in the show notes as well. Finally, Ian, there must be a transition period to all this. Briefly, what does that look like at this point in time?
So once we have got all of the feedback we need from firms through that application test phase that I mentioned, and we're able to firm up both what the new criteria should look like, and we're able to sort of finalize that consultation feedback and make sure we've addressed as many as possible of those concerns, and that we've confirmed what the business model will need to look like at the CII, then we'll be able to announce a date from which new applications will be welcomed. And for existing firms, we're expecting to then say, for 18 months from that date, you'll have a choice to apply under the existing rules, either to give yourself more time to adjust to the new rules, get the data together, etc., but also to make sure that there's more of a budget transition phase where if the fees are different, then you'll have time to figure out how to approach those. So probably an 18-month phase from when we announce those, we make those new rules and criteria available for new applicants to apply.
Fabulous. Well, look, thank you ever so much for joining me today, Ian. There are articles in the current edition of PFP magazine and the Journal in a few weeks' time, and there's lots of information on our Corporate Chartered Consultation webpage as well.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal podcast. You can find useful links in the show notes and related articles on the Journal website, along with further podcasts. Please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.